So I want you to think for just a moment. You're all sitting around a table tonight, right? The chatter is happening. You're having conversation. I want to try to take you for just a moment to that last meal that the disciples have with Jesus. It was probably very similar to this, right? They're sitting around, they're having conversation, and Jesus starts to talk. Things become quite important. Now remember, they're celebrating this feast called the Passover feast. I want you to think of the Passover feast like 4th of July for many of us. It's a big deal because they're celebrating freedom, right? They're remembering when God protected them, brought them provision, and freed them from the Egyptians. So it's a big deal. And this Passover feast that they're having with Jesus, I can't imagine that they thought this would be the last one. I can't imagine that they were sitting there going, well, this is probably the end. Instead, they're like, we're celebrating. This is a great night. And Jesus sort of turns the table a little bit and he says, these are important words. This is an important meal. Important things are happening. And then Jesus gets to that scripture. But I wonder how focused they were in that moment. Oh, guys, we've been cutting up. Like, we need to pay attention. Jesus is saying really, really important stuff. There was an important moment that happened this week for many. I didn't really experience the way that I saw a lot of people were experiencing it. It was a fire, right? The fire at the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And it was this really, really big deal. And I'm seeing all these people on social media and stuff going, I can't believe it's on fire. And you see videos of people who are weeping at this cathedral in Paris. Now, I will tell you, I've never been there. So, right, if you've been there, it probably has more meaning for you, right? If you're Catholic, it might have more meaning for you. But it seemed to be a really potent thing. So I started to research, why is this so important to people? I mean, things catch on fire often, right? I mean, buildings catch on fire. And I read that this building is over 850 years old. This building has survived many, many things. World leaders like Hitler, it has made it through those times. It made it through the French Revolution. Right? It made it through World War I, through World War II. And I really didn't understand why this was such a big deal until I read one particular woman's tweet. And this is what she said. She said, I don't really have words for how I feel about Notre Dame today. But the closest I can get is thinking about how impossible losing something as immutable and symbolic as that cathedral felt before today. She said, it's like watching an ocean dry up. It wasn't supposed to be possible. It wasn't supposed to be possible. I sat on those words as I read that tweet, and I wonder if the disciples felt that way when Jesus started to tell them that the time was coming. No, this isn't possible. Right? It's not supposed to be possible that there's a time when Jesus isn't with us. That's what we've been learning and growing, and we've given our life to him. It's not supposed to be possible. And they have the dinner, and they sit around the table, and then Jesus gives them this information, this thing that happens that Alyssa just read, and I'm going to read you pieces of it again. It says, a dispute also arose among them as to which of them was considered to be the greatest. Jesus said to them, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest of you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who's at the table or the one who serves? And then he goes on and he talks specifically to Simon or Peter, whatever name he decides to give him at this moment in time. He says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. But he replied, Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. And Jesus answered, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you'll deny 3 times that you know me. I wonder what Peter's tweet would have been after this conversation this night. Like, I wonder what he would have said. Would he have said, what Jesus just said is not possible. What he told me is impossible. There's no way that I could do what he's saying. I mean, y'all, if you've ever heard me talk about Peter, he's not as glamorous to me as he is to most people. Most people sort of hold Peter as sort of second to Jesus in the church, right? Peter, the rock, the important one, Peter. But Peter came back at Jesus that night to say, Jesus, what you're saying is not possible. There is no way, Jesus, that I will fail you. There is no way that whatever happens, I would ever deny you. Peter's got some confidence, doesn't he? He's got some boldness in him. I mean, essentially, Peter's saying, Jesus, you don't know what you're talking about. There's no way that I could do that to you, Jesus. And if you know the story, Peter goes on and he does exactly what Jesus says. But Peter looks at Jesus and says, Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. He's essentially saying, I cannot fail this mission. There is no way that I won't go all the way with you, Jesus. Every single place you go. Can you imagine how Peter felt at that moment when Jesus told him he was going to fail? When he said, there's no way. When Jesus said, you're going to deny me, Peter, it's going to happen. And you would think that Peter would get this idea of failure, right? Because it happened before. Right? Earlier in the gospel, according to Matthew, this happens where Peter is in a boat and Jesus comes up on the water. And Peter looks out and he says, Jesus, if that's you, tell me to walk out on the water. And Jesus goes, all right. Walk out on the water. And Peter does, and he steps out on the water. And then all of a sudden, he gets scared. He loses faith. And what happens? He sinks. And for those who are not the biggest fans of Peter, we could think that's the whole part of the story. But how many of the other disciples got out of the boat? Right? How many of the rest of them stepped out and said, Jesus, I'm going to go with you? So there's something really powerful in Peter. There's something powerful about the guy who says, I will not fail. We've been in this sermon series for a few weeks called Reckless Love. And I was thinking this week, I wonder how Peter loved people. Like, did he worry like I sometimes do that maybe he'd be rejected when he went and talked to people? Did he worry that if he loved somebody, somebody might not love him back? Or did Peter use this mentality of failure is not an option in every relationship that he had? I mean, if we look at the dedication he has to Jesus, he seems to deeply, deeply love. Be deeply committed. I was listening to this guy who was a church planter last week, and that's somebody who starts churches. And he was talking about, he started this big church out in Chicago. And he came to us and he said, I want to talk to you about all the things I've learned. And he said, I wrote this book, it's called Failure. He said, the only way to grow a church is to be willing to fail. Over and over and over again, because people who are willing to fail are willing to give it everything they have. That's what Peter was saying back to Jesus that night. I'm willing to give you everything that I have. I think in Peter's willingness, there is a deep trust. There's a trust in the redemptive power of Jesus. There's a trust in, I've been with you, and I'm going to journey with you, and I'm going to walk with you. And Peter says, I will do anything in the world that you need. I heard a ridiculous story this week. It was about a 12-year-old girl in New York City. She had chicken nuggets. This boy at the table wanted her chicken nuggets. She, being a very strong woman, looked at him and said, no, you can't have my chicken nuggets. She didn't eat half of her chicken nuggets, and she put them in her bag. And he said, why can't I have your chicken nuggets? She said, not my chicken nuggets. So she left that day in her bag with her chicken nuggets. And that boy followed her. And he followed her later down a road, and there was nobody there. And the boy grabbed a weapon. And he said, give me your chicken nuggets. And you know, that little girl, she grabbed that weapon out of his hand. She threw it on the ground, and she said, you cannot have my chicken nuggets. Now, if anybody ever does that to you, give them the chicken nuggets, okay? That's the moral of the story. That's the important part. But I wonder, what would it be like to have such conviction about something that you're willing to do whatever it takes for it? As the disciples sat around that table, as they walked out that night, many of us know the story. They get scared, right? They run. But at the end of the day, they keep the mission alive, because at the end of the day, they know it is so important that they're going to do anything for it. It's funny, in this series about reckless love, I've started to wonder, why don't we love the way that Jesus loves? And I think at the crux of the situation is that we're not willing to do anything it takes to love people. We're not willing to do anything it takes. Now, here's the beauty. When we fail, right, when it happens, Jesus can still do redemptive work. The story of Peter is not done when he messes up 3 times. It goes on to say, when they had finished eating at the end of the gospel, according to John, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." And the 3rd time he said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus had asked him a 3rd time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." And one way that I translate that is love my people. Go out and love people. Jesus says to Peter, if you love me, then go out and love others. Give it all of who you are. I want to tell you tonight that I think as we come around the table, as we receive communion together, what Jesus is saying is, stand strong like Peter, don't be afraid to fail, and go and love people. Love the hardest that you can, get rid of judgment, and go out and love. Stand strong, believing that failure is not an option for you. Knowing that you will fail, but knowing that Jesus has a great thing that he can do for you.